Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And welcome to the briefing on predicting and preventing youth violence. I want to welcome everyone here. Particularly want to recognize the youth from Kids Count who are with us from London. Linda, you want to stand up? Have everyone stand up? They're doing some of what we're doing in England, so it's good to see you here. In the wake of the Aurora tragedy and tragedies that are playing out every day in some of our cities, we could not be focused on a more important and timely topic. For too long, we've seen these tragedies unfold despite considerable body of evidence, knowledge, and demonstrated competencies that we have to substantially reduce these incidences. And while the incidences of mass violence, such as the Colorado and Virginia Tech, present a different challenge, more can be done to avert such tragedies and reduce systemic violence that plays out in our communities every day. When we look at substantially lower levels of violence in places like New York City and now Los Angeles, as we will hear about in a hearing on gangs tomorrow in the Crime Subcommittee, we begin to see that violence can be reduced. Our speakers today will talk about what is necessary to do this and why we must convert our thinking on how to address violence from politically based approaches to what science and evidence shows is to be effective. I've been a legislator now in the state and federal level for 35 years, and during that time I have learned that when it comes to crime, we have a choice. We can reduce crime by doing what science and evidence says is effective, or we can play politics and do what politics of crime says is effective. The politics of crime involves tough on crime slogans and sound bites, poll tested, such as 3 strikes and you're out, abolish parole, truth in sentencing, mandatory minimum sentences, and if you can get it to rhyme, it's even better. If you do the adult crime, you do the adult time, and things like that. The evidence shows that while these tough on crime approaches sound good, they range from having little to do with preventing crime to actually increasing crime. Under the tough on crime approach, no matter how tough we were last year, you have to get tougher this year. We've been getting tougher and tougher by the year. For over 30 years now, we've gone from 200,000 people incarcerated in the United States to over 2 million, with an annual prison cost going up accordingly. With the result of these approaches today, the United States is the world's leading incarcerator. Can I get a copy of the charts? Leading incarcerator. And we've passed out charts that point this out. The top chart shows incarceration rate around the United States, shows that we are by far and away the largest incarcerator in the world. The African American rates are just off the chart. One thing about over 700 per 100,000 incarceration rate, 7 times the international average, is that it's over the 500 level that the Pew Research Center has calculated is actually counterproductive. Incarcerating that many people, not only are we not reducing crime, we're actually adding to the crime rate when you have rates as high as that. The problem is that tough on crime policies simply do not and cannot work to reduce crime. Research as well as common sense tells us that no matter how tough we are on the people we prosecute today, unless we address the underlying reasons for crime, young people will follow the same trajectory and will be committing the same crimes tomorrow. The next cohort of crime will simply replace those we take out, and crime will continue. So just getting tough has little impact on the crime rate. It may be an appropriate response to crime, but you're not going to reduce crime. All of the credible research and evidence shows that a comprehensive strategy of evidence-based interventions and support aimed at high-risk and at-risk youth will significantly reduce crime and save much more money than you spend. we're already on the hook with at-risk youth of what we're going to be spending if we do not intervene on law enforcement and other social service costs. If we do something, we can reduce those costs, and all of the programs have been shown to actually save more than we spend. And what we know is that these approaches are most effective when they're in the context of a coordinated, collaborative strategy involving all of the players affected by the issue. Obviously law enforcement, but also the schools, social services, mental health, nonprofit after-school programs, faith-based community, and business representatives who will work with children at risk of being involved in the criminal justice system. We saw how this kind of approach can work in my district in Richmond, Virginia, through a coordinated approach, grant of $2.5 million from the gang reduction program, set up a collaborative federal, state, and local government program. The murder rate in that area went down from 19 to 2. The 19 murders represented over 40 shootings, all of which were likely to be indigent care patients at the Medical College of Virginia Emergency Facility in Richmond. And if you compare the cost of 40 shootings instead of 5 or 6, that difference alone might be enough to pay for the $2.5 million program, to say nothing about the fewer arrests, prosecutions, and incarcerations. And when you look at a comprehensive approach, when you reduce gang violence, you're also reducing things like teen pregnancy and all of the costs associated with that. So obviously we saved a lot more than we spent. Los Angeles had a similar pilot program and experienced similar results, so much so that it became part of the foundation for establishing its highly successful, comprehensive citywide anti-gang program that we're going to hear about tomorrow. Continuing undeniable success of this evidence-based approach helped reform the Youth Promise Act, Youth Prison Reduction through Opportunities, Mentoring, Intervention, Support, and Education. It's an acronym for PROMISE. This legislation provides for the formation of comprehensive, collaborative, community-based approaches to applying evidence-based strategies targeted at at-risk and high-risk youth to prevent violence and crime. We started comprehensive, very early teen pregnancy prevention, so fewer people will be born into dysfunctional families, prenatal care, which can reduce memory retardation and learning disabilities, prenatal training for new parents, and nurse visits to help reduce child abuse, which is highly correlated with future crime, quality early childhood education, preschool, quality after-school programs, summer recreational programs, summer jobs for older teens, guaranteed scholarships for those who graduate from high school and can get into college, all of which will help dismantle the cradle-to-prison pipeline and create a cradle-to-college or cradle-to-the-workforce pipeline. This kind of approach has reduced violence and crime in communities that have been put into play all over the nation, and beyond that, we need to do everything we can to address violence and crime, and these approaches have shown to be extremely effective. Rather than asking whether we can afford to do it or not, the back of the chart shows how much we're wasting in counterproductive incarceration, and in many areas, there are areas of the country where they're wasting the equivalent of about $10,000 per child per year, per at-risk child per year in counterproductive incarceration. We can put that money to much better use. At this time, we're going to recognize the ranking member, former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, John Conyers, the gentleman from Michigan, for any comments that you would like to make.
Thank you, Chairman Bobby Scott, of the former chairman of the Subcommittee on Crime. I want to congratulate you and join you in welcoming the 4 medical people that are here, one of which is a psychologist. And I want to thank everybody for coming. This is a very creative idea of Bobby Scott's, and I really think you ought to give him a round of applause for this. And the first thing I did when I came to Congress was get on the Judiciary Committee. The second thing I did was get on the Subcommittee on Crime. So I can attest to the kind of work that Bobby Scott is doing. It's tough, it's difficult, it's challenging, and it's very important. So I thank you all very much for being here, and I look forward, like you do, to hearing the rest of this panel. Thank you, Chairman Scott.
Thank you. Our speakers today will begin with Dr. Robert John Zager. He's a clinical psychologist, researcher, professor, economist, statistician, and author of over 40 articles and books, including Predicting and Preventing Homicide, a cost-effective empirical approach from infancy to adulthood. He's an expert in research design and statistics and has developed approaches for targeting interventions to prevent violence at the macro level in communities and actuarial assessment at the micro level. He received his bachelor's from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, master's from Illinois Institute of Technology, and another master's from the University of Illinois Chicago, and a doctorate from Northwestern University. We expected, but he was not able to. An emergency came up. Steve Troubeau was expected to be here. He is the founder and head of Olympic Behavior Labs, a research and consultant. Olympic Behavior Labs produces a predictive software to predict and prevent youth violence and gang activity. He's not going to be here, but Dr. Zager will mention some of his research. We'll then hear from Peter Scharf, nationally recognized leader in criminal justice training, technology, and education. He was recently appointed as research professor at Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medical International Health Department. He is, while at Texas State and now at Tulane, he managed a PREA risk management, PREA risk management project designed to identify and manage the risk of rape in prison. He has testified 3 times before the House Judiciary Committee regarding murder trends and worked with Stuart Baker of the White House on an assessment of the federal response to Hurricane Katrina. Achieved his A.B. from the University of Rochester and his doctorate from Harvard University. Professor Catherine Gallagher is an associate professor and director of the Cochrane Collaborative College of Policy, Criminology, Law, and Society at George Mason University. She focuses on improving the intersection between healthcare and justice agencies to better meet the needs of high-risk populations and the public health in their larger communities. She also develops, monitors, and analyzes national statistical programs and provides federal agencies with policy guidance, working with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Centers for Disease Control, and the Office of the Surgeon General, among others. She received her BA from the College of Worcester, Ohio, and her PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Adam Dobrin. He is the field administrator for the new Cochrane Justice Health field at George Mason University. Justice Health is about health care of the millions of persons under the control of various criminal and juvenile justice systems, as well as the health implications for their families, future generations, and communities from which they come. Justice Health aims to identify gaps that exist in our understanding and set priorities for approaching the most pressing social and clinical questions pertinent to health care delivery for this population. He earned his bachelor's degree in sociology from the College of William and Mary, and both his master's and doctorate in criminology from the University of Maryland. So please welcome Dr. Zager, who will begin the discussion.
Thank you for coming today, and I'm enjoying this beautiful city that I've only come to twice before, but it's nice to come from Chicago to a different place. And I come from the first juvenile court in the world at Cook County and Northwestern University. And what I want to talk about first is Steve Troubeau's work, and his approach to crime is basically up there on the PowerPoint, and it's risks, needs, and responsivity. It's an evidence-based approach, and what Steve has is a real-time IBM computer system that can track people as they're going through either the school system, the criminal system, or both, or the mental health system. And it's just like what the military or businesses use in terms of prediction. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. What I want to talk about today is two very practical approaches. How can we reduce violence and save money at the same time? So we're talking about saving lives and saving money. The next slide. Why do we have homicide in the United States? And what can we do to reduce it? And why is it important? We have as many deaths on the streets of the United States as we have on the battlefields since 1776. Less than 1 million people have died on the battlefield, and over 1 million have died on the streets. So if you look at that very carefully, you've got to think that in some areas of our cities, it's as dangerous as being in Afghanistan. So what I've tried to divide this into a macro approach and a micro approach. On the macroeconomic side, we developed a program in Chicago that saved 52 lives in the high schools over 4 years. Now, with an investment of roughly $20 million. So that's $77 million in Justice Department funds. And if you're getting a savings of 52 lives and you reduce assaults by 76 or 77%, you have a 297 million savings. So you divide that 297 by the 77 that you spent, and you have a return on investment of $3.88 for every dollar you spend. So for those who are looking at this from a cost-benefit approach, which is really important because the people who make the decisions, the banks, the investment firms, and you, the citizen who pay your taxes, this is something that works. So what did we do? If you look at this slide on the homicide rate over a century, you see two big drops in the homicide rate. And believe it or not, it's the same as it is in Europe for our colleagues from London. It's 6 per 100,000. That's a lot. We went from 1 to 6. It dropped after World War II because we went through a job boom. And it dropped again in the 90s during the Clinton administration because of the dot-com era. So if you have 1 and 1, it equals to 2, a job makes a difference. So if you give the violent youth that you've identified mathematically, the thugs, a job, they can't go out and kill you. The next slide. I met with Mayor Daley and his chiefs of staff, Mike Masters and Mary Karen, and we looked at this particular slide. Jobs divert youth from delinquency 37%. The other two things that work were mentors and anger management, 25%. So what they did is they designed a program called Culture of Calm that gave these high-risk youth a job and a mentor, and then taught them how to control their anger. And so that's the macro approach, and what I'll talk about later is the micro approach. I met with Cook County President Tony Kreckwinkle, and I gave her a copy of the book that I've just shared with the two eminent representatives here, and some projections that it only costs $2,000 a year to put somebody in electronic surveillance, and it costs us in Cook County $18,500. Those who are from California, it's up to $40,000 per year. She read the book, took it seriously, and the next week went court by court saying all future nonviolent prisoners are going electronic surveillance. And we've saved probably at least $10 million in Cook County already. And this can be done in other places in the United States. It costs more to go to jail than it is to go to Yale. This is not some ivory tower academic exercise. This is a case study in how to save lives and money at the community and at the organizational level. We've already done it in Chicago and in Cook County. We saved 52 lives, which were calculated by multiplying the 46% reduction in shootings on this population that were in up to 38 high schools over 4 years by 32%. This is a conversion that was developed by some economists at Columbia University. So we saved $297 million. That's calculated by multiplying 4 million times the number of lives saved. And 77% by multiplying the number of assaults that were reduced, 77% times the roughly 3,000 or so that were exposed to this program by 29,000. That's the cost that the National Institutes of Justice calculates and solve this work. So the cost of the program again is $77 million. The return on investment is 3.88. This is really important because we need to show that if you're going to use a program, it's got to have a return. It's just like if you're doing this in business. And in Chicago, we have a situation where violent youth come down into the central district and hurt tourists and business people. And this is happening in Detroit. This is happening in Richmond. This is happening in California, in Beverly Hills. It's happening in New York. It's Boston, New Orleans, wherever you want to go. Businessmen spend billions on building hotels, on building restaurants, and on bringing tourists into their cities. And they don't want violent-prone youth who don't have a job, who don't have anger management, and don't have mentors to prey on citizens. So even if one uses the cost of $1 million, because some people have said, oh gee, a life isn't worth $4.4 million, which I calculate now, you still know that from Harvard professors Skip Viscusi and Galbraith that it's probably worth $2 to $3 million. You still get a positive return on investment. We calculate the figures, and so it's $2 or $2.50 for every dollar spent. So if we go back to the last slide, you can see why this is important. The homicide rate started at the beginning of the century at 1 per 100,000. Now it's 6 per 100,000. This is a serious issue. So let's go forward. If we, and Representative Scott alluded to this, go one more forward. One more. One more. If you look at this curve, and you remember the curve that you just saw on the murder rates, they're the same curve. And going back to what Representative Scott said, we've passed the optimal imprisonment rate. At 775 per 100,000, you're not getting any reduction in the murder rate. It's not working. As I showed you, jobs reduced the murder rate, not imprisonment. Okay, so if 30% of your state budgets are going to courts and jails, and we have the highest jail rate in history in the world, we need to find another solution. Okay, how do we do this? First, we have to know how do we find the murders, then what works, and then what does it cost? The Zagar math model was repeated on another group of about 500 shooters in Chicago. Mayor Daley calls the former CEO of Chicago Public Schools every week. Did you repeat it? Did you repeat it? 3 economists from the University of Chicago and 3 other statisticians from the police department and the public schools replicated our model. They found the highest risk youth They were the ones that were academically failing. They were the ones that were truant and expelled. They had many behavioral problems in school. And they gave them a job. They gave them anger management, how do you control your anger, and they gave them a mentor. The shootings went down 46%, the assaults 77%. If you can go back, look at those figures of go back one more. That's how many lives we save. We have about 50 youth murders a year. So we save 50 lives. In 4 years, that's 1/4 of the people who would be dead now. The next one forward, we saved assaults. Now you'd say, well, that's not very many. But think of 60,000 teachers who are assaulted every year in the schools. So any assault, any reduction in assaults is significant. Okay, Chicago lacks 3,000 to 5,000 police officers. Why? Because we're spending so much on jails. Okay, the culture of calm lowered shootings and assaults. And this is a problem that exists from Oakland to New Orleans, from DC to Miami, from Phoenix to LA, from Milwaukee to Houston, Detroit to Dallas. But there are solutions. What drives this 0.01 homicide rate in organizations? The answer is to know the risks. The risks are single parents, gangs, alcohol and drugs, and poor decision making. Farrington describes it very simply. A series of bells that are going up over the century. From Cambridge, he's looked at this. And if you go, there were flat bells and now we have a peaked bell. And Moffat at King's College, also in Great Britain, talks about a belt, chronics. And these chronic abusers become the chronic career delinquents who become the career criminals. And fortunately, the copycats drop out around 25 when they get a job and they have a family and kids. In essence, there are two little sound bites that you could remember. A boy with a good home, a family, a school, and a job doesn't go to jail. The child treats the world the way the world treats the child. If you remember that, that's basically it. So Mayor Daley saved lives and costs by targeting the highest risks. And now on the micro side, what you can do is we're about 97 to 99% accurate at predicting abuse, murder, mental health issues, and substance abuse. We can apply that to our prisons. We save about $17 billion if we could release people to electronic surveillance. Why don't you go forward and look at these? One more. These are the cost savings in our prison system. And this is really important. We have an overloaded prison system in Cook County. It's 1 square mile on the west side of Chicago. And I know Michigan has this. I know Virginia has the same issue. I was just on the phone to someone in California. They're building a new prison. They built it, but they don't have the money to staff it. We just had to sell a prison in Illinois to the federal government because we didn't have the money to staff it. Look at the prison costs on the left. And the second bar is the cost for the nonviolent prisons. And that's California, Michigan, the states that are represented on this committee. And the last cost is about 10% of that, which is the cost for electronic surveillance. It's a no-brainer. We have to go this way. We don't have the money. Let's go to the next slide. Here's the cost in California, where the largest cost is. It's $8.5 billion in the prison system per year. They're under a federal consent decree. They can't actually put more prisoners in their jails. Then it's 6.4 just for the nonviolent, and it's 388 million for electronic surveillance. This is an option for our future. Why? We've diverted 30% of our state budgets from infrastructure, from roads, from bridges, We need to be competitive with the Chinese and the Indians and the European Union. And this frees up money for more police on our streets. We're short in Chicago. We're short in New Orleans. We're short in Oakland. We're short all over the country. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, there's some more states. And another one. And it's the same curves everywhere in the country. We did the projections across 50 states with the engineers at Northwestern, and it doesn't matter where you go, the savings are $17 billion across the system. And so crime is expensive. It costs $110 billion a year. Violent crime, $60 billion. You and I are paying the price. We pay for the taxes. We pay the insurance premiums. It's coming out of your pocket. We can mathematically identify people who are violent with regression models at the community level, with simple testing at the organizational level. This thing in Colorado and Aurora did not have to happen. We could have found this individual and got them treatment and medication. I'm absolutely convinced Columbine didn't have to happen. Virginia Tech didn't have to happen. We really need to look at things from a mathematical and scientific approach. And I'm really appreciative that Representative Scott had us here. So basically, if we were to expand this program, this Culture of Calm, to 52 cities, we'd save 2,550 lives and $14.85 billion. That's 600 lives a year and $3.7 billion per year. Giving jobs helps people win elections. For the cost of $1 billion, you're getting about $4 for every dollar you spend. We can move nonviolent prisoners to electronic surveillance and save $17 billion. Thank you for allowing me and my wife Agatha is here to show you that there's hope for others. And I want to thank my relatives and my family who served in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, and now. And I'm dedicating this talk to Gabby Gifford because I really believe that we can avoid situations like that. Thank you.
Dr. Gallagher.
As always, thank you to Congressman Scott and Congressman Conyers for having me and my research team. My name is Catherine Gallagher. I'm from George Mason University, where I direct the Cochrane Collaboration College for Policy. If you're in the healthcare business at all, or in the social science evidence synthesis business, yeah, you might be familiar. There's a worldwide organization dedicated to quantitatively synthesizing the effectiveness of interventions. So we come to this from an approach of looking at the highest rigor evidence to identify what programs are most effective using the highest rigor research. We also do cost-benefit analyses, and part of our work right now is with the Pew Center for the States. A cost study that will come out this fall and hopefully answer with some confidence some of our questions about how much we spend for kids in facilities and kids in the under supervision and probation in the community. But today we are here to talk a little bit about it's an ongoing theme that we've developed over the course of several of these briefings. So this is sort of installment number 6 or so of a series of talks. So today we're going to talk about violent injury prevention needs and the effectiveness of health services interventions. We come to this having presented a few different studies in briefings such as this. That showed different rates of firearm injuries, costs of firearm injuries, spending from the federal government on prevention programs, and we had reached a few conclusions. Some of those conclusions I'm just going to go ahead and summarize now. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on with the slides here. We don't need to do this yet. Thank you. Okay. So as Dr. Zager's already illustrated, some of the conclusions we've reached, and these are not conclusions that will surprise you, but violence is just one of many negative life outcomes. Violence among youth particularly is an outcome that reflects and runs parallel to other many negative life outcomes, such as unemployment, failure to finish school, failure to engage in pro-social relationships, and some consider it maybe one symptom of an underlying syndrome, maybe a failing to thrive in a social and health kind of way. And anyway, no matter what way we look at violence, it's wrong to look at violence as a single individual phenomenon, but rather we look at it as entangled among other social, economic, and health outcomes. We also know that violence and adolescent crime is intimately tied to different developmental trajectories. And so when we think about violence, we don't think about a single event happening all of a sudden when a child turns 14 and does a violent act. Rather, we see it as a part of a developmental narrative that has been ongoing since even prenatal time. And what we find across the literature, especially the high rigor literature, is that these developmental trajectories, again, they begin very early, even in the prenatal period. They have risk factors and milestones and markers that are predictable across the life course. These narratives can be changed. Obviously, if they couldn't be changed, we wouldn't be sitting here having these discussions. But even more important than changing is preventing these narratives from occurring in the first place. And what we've talked about in past briefings is showing some evidence that prevention is more advantageous economically speaking. Prevention, especially in the crime realm, is beneficial across different outcomes. So when you prevent crime, you prevent other negative social and economic outcomes. You prevent teen pregnancy, you prevent dropping out of school, you prevent failure for communities to thrive. So we come from a perspective that, of course, we can change individuals and that narrative can be changed, but it's more economic and better to prevent early. And that resonates well with the tenets of the Youth Promise Act, and so that's why it's very easy for us to use the high rigor research to come and support what's proposed in the Youth Promise Act. Anyway, in brief, and I think Dr. Zager's already illustrated this, but one of the things that we've shown in the past briefings is the fact that violence isn't randomly distributed. It's very much concentrated. It's concentrated geographically in terms of regions, in terms of cities, in terms of neighborhoods, in terms of blocks, corners, households, families, and most importantly, it's concentrated within individuals. We also know that violence is concentrated among people of color, and it's also concentrated pretty predictably among people with known risk factors such as failure to thrive in the education setting, persons with poor health outcomes and mental health outcomes, polymorbidities, especially in health and mental health, the substance abuse struggles, and employment and family troubles as well. Trauma and abandonment is another common theme that we see in our research and the research concerning youth involved in violence. But one of the takeaway points I think we'd like to make is, one of the takeaway points first is that crime is an outcome among many outcomes that are negative life outcomes. So that's point one, but point two is that the youth that we see in the juvenile justice system on their risk factors are very much the same as youth in other social welfare systems. And so again, it goes back to this reiteration that dealing with the crime problem means dealing with the health problem, dealing with the school problem, dealing with the family problem. And so that's the perspective we bring to it. One of our last conclusions was that we spend more on medical care for firearm injuries than the entire combined federal budget last year for crime prevention. And so we find this completely wrong equation in terms of where we put our dollars. That again, we spent something like 4 times as much on medical care for injuries for young people who are shot than than the U.S. government, federal government, that is invested in helping states do prevention programs, among other things. So today, what we're really looking at is a question about, to further move us along the trajectory we've been embarking on with these talks, is what can health service providers do to prevent violence among adolescents? And what we really hope to achieve in today's talk is to provide an overview of high rigor evidence on the effectiveness of healthcare-based interventions. So I can tell you a little bit about why we care about that, but in part, we care about healthcare interventions, again, because we know that these outcomes are related, but secondly, because we know that victims who, especially victims of serious violence, who've received healthcare treatment, tend to do better in the long term than victims who don't. Now, there's an answer of why is this the case, or a question of why is this the case. And one of the issues is it a specific intervention that healthcare providers are offering? Doubtful. We know that there's a lot of variability in terms of what healthcare providers do within organizations and across organizations. Some have posited that this is a teachable moment where you can use an opportunity between a trusted health professional and a youth who's been injured to provide information, education, and even some empathy about what the child's facing. Another issue is selection bias, which in research terms basically means that the people who go and seek healthcare treatment are different systematically than the ones who wouldn't seek the same treatment for an injury. And usually that's because people who are injured or sometimes involved in crime themselves are worried about their citizenship status or have other reasons for not engaging with the police. But nonetheless, there remains a very strong, robust effect that suggests that youth and adults who have been victims of violence do better if they are given intervention, medical treatment, and we don't know what on top. And so what we'd like to do is to look at what it is that they might potentially offer. By way of charts, because I can't possibly do a talk without some graphs and charts, what I wanted to do is, we've already gotten a good taste of this, but these figures are from our most recent year of data collection, and this is in 2010, and what we see, I know you can't read them, among that same population, we had nearly 2,000 homicides by firearms in 2010, and again, controlling for population size, we do see that among the black males, we have a rate of about 40 per 100,000, and among Hispanic males, about 14. So these patterns, again, are not random. They are stable over time, and they haven't been changing. And one of the things that we concluded in one of our last talks, and one of the things that really informs today's talk, is over the past decade, we didn't see a decrease among the firearm injury rates for adolescents. So while we might have enjoyed a decrease in the property crime rates and some violent crime rates in other areas, we didn't see it. It was stable over time for this group. So it means that from our point of view, the question and the people we need to be looking at are these young people who are injured or killed in firearm injuries, in firearm violent events, excuse me. So today I'm going to stop talking in about 2 seconds and turn it over to my colleague who's going to get into some of the meat of the programs. But we offer here a little bit of a conceptual model for thinking about how interventions can work for firearm injuries. And we can see in this slide that we're talking about interventions that take place as early as the prenatal period all the way up to young adult period. We're talking also about interventions that can focus on care providers, like the mother of the family and other members and care providers. We can talk about interventions that look directly at the youth, him or herself. We can look at interventions dealing after the fact with injured youth, and we can also look at interventions that deal with clinicians who serve youth. And there are all sorts of different types of programs. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the effectiveness.
sorry. What that is a snapshot of a review that we've begun to examine the impact and effects of medical professional interventions with violence. And this is a huge range of actual programs. It could be, like Dr. Gallagher said, prenatal. It could be all the way up to teaching family members about firearm storage, safety. It could be dealing with victims of violence to teach them how to not engage in situations to put themselves at risk for future violence. But all of these interventions are based on actions of medical, clinical professionals. And this is a drastically underused population that we're sort of overlooking. That in terms of violence, this is a group of people who deal with victims of violence quite often, or at least the people who are involved in violent situations. And the studies that we've looked at all seem to have a pretty stable, beneficial effect. As Representative Scott mentioned, a lot of times policies backfire, they make things worse. With looking at clinical intervention by medical professionals for reducing violence, that doesn't seem to be the case. There might be some studies where there's no impact, but so far there doesn't seem to be any that makes it worse. So that's a great first step right there. But a lot of them do seem to have positive impacts, that they do not necessarily reduce violence, but injury from violence. As I said before, toddlers are a good target for this as well, for medical intervention, because people take their babies to the doctor quite often, and the parents of toddlers obviously are really the best target. The toddler himself picking up a whole lot of information at that point. Firearm storage reduction practices, future re-injury, reduction of aggressive behavior patterns, they all seem to have good impact. Healthcare is one of the few opportunities throughout a person's life. School is a great opportunity for intervention with kids, but they move around, they go to different teachers, they drop out, they don't pay attention, but sooner or later, everybody goes to a doctor. Now, the high-risk population that we're talking about, the high-risk youth population, they have a very bad, what we call a medical home, a history, a stable doctor, that sort of thing. But if they are involved in these sort of activities, eventually they'll end up at least in the emergency room. So that's an opportunity of intervention. That a lot of the programs for emergency room interventions do seem to have a good, strong impact on reducing either future victimization or the offending, the actual violent activity of the person who is the victim. That itself is an intimate relationship that is often overlooked. That to reduce victimization, a great path is to reduce offending or vice versa. That offending and victimization are intimately linked, and to reduce one is to reduce the other. So if you do reduce the victimization of victims of violent crime, you're going to have a net drop of offending and violent crime as well, and vice versa. To reduce offending, you reduce victimization. As Dr. Zager mentioned, to reduce violent victimization, it has a tremendous economic impact, but we need to also take into account the social impact that we're stopping people or preventing people from being injured. It's great to say we're saving a lot of money, but it's better to say that we're preventing people from receiving these horrible injuries. As these programs attempt to reduce injury from violence, as I said, some of them are designed specifically to reduce the engaging in violence as well, and so we get a double benefit for the expenditures. Medical professionals are clearly overextended, they're stressed, they're taxed. This is something that's in the news constantly, that our medical system is potentially at a breaking point, and so it's difficult to ask this system to take another task to involve itself in preventing and reducing risk for violent victimization and offending. But in terms of cost-benefit, this is a very beneficial strategy to engage in. And so the research, this is a snapshot of the research that we're starting a project on to look at different programs. This is just a list of different studies and what their interventions are, who the target audiences are, and whether or not they had a beneficial impact or not. And they do seem to be having good impacts, and at the best, they're not causing any harm. In conclusion, firearm injuries in the past decade for adolescents have not declined. We can look at overall violent crime rates, homicide rates, and there does seem to be a net decrease, but for a juvenile population, it's remained very stable, primarily impacting males and youth of color. The current federal investments to deal with this crime are less than the amount spent on dealing with the medical costs of firearm injuries. Healthcare professionals are an underutilized resource. It's one that no one ever even thinks of using medical professionals as a violence prevention intervention technique, but the evidence is clear that it's a good place to start. It's low cost relative to the cost of incarcerating someone or the justice system costs. And the rigorous reviews of the evidence show that almost inevitably based on very different settings, home-based settings, school-based settings, emergency room settings, these have a good, efficient impact on reducing violence and victimization and offending. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Dr. Peter Sharp from, okay, that's good. I'm Dr. Peter Sharp from New Orleans, and you know we're really exotic and interesting. We're also, you may not realize, the highest murder rate city in the United States. Last Monday, we had 5 people murdered, and yesterday I think we had 3. And with all respects to what happened in Aurora, we're going to hit 20 murders this month in July, in 1 month. We had 26 in January. Last year we had, is my PowerPoint loaded up there?
Yes.
Can't go. Okay, I'm going to talk anyway. We had 200. We had 200 murders last year for a city of 242,000 people, and this year we're going to have another 200 murders. And my talk centers on something that builds on the presentations you've heard. And why are some of these high-risk murder cities, why are they resistant to change? You know, in New Orleans we read about the blip in murders in Chicago. And Chicago is under 20 per 100,000. New Orleans could hit 60 per 100,000 this year. So, and there are 9 cities with murder rates over 30 per 100,000. And the question I want to address with you, and you know, I know we're going to get a chance to dialogue, is what is it about these cities? First of all, I want to start an argument. And I've been, I think, at 30 murder scenes this year in New Orleans, another 30 last year. The typical New Orleans murder is an assassination. And there are ways you can code that. You can say, oh, they're products of poverty, and they're arguments, and they're beefs. They're assassinations. Our murders occur at 4 in the afternoon, or when somebody's lunch with their girlfriend. And the reason they occur at that time is because they're kind of drowsy. They just ate a Subway sandwich, and they're easy to kill. Most of the murders in New Orleans, as near as any of us can tell, are byproducts of a vibrant drug culture. And you have students, and we actually had honor students who were murdered this year. We had 2, what's KIPP, I believe, Knowledge is Power students murdered, and they drifted into the drug traffic, which is absolutely lethal. I printed out the PowerPoint, so we'll get you all this. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. And then let's go to the next one. How's this work? Go to the next one. These are the 800 murders that occurred since 2008. The reason I picked that because Representative Scott and Council Vassar, we held a murder hearing, Katrina hearing in New Orleans. Boy, were we stupid. And I was the stupidest. I thought we'd have 90 murders. I went up there and I said, if we only followed evidence-based practice, if we did all the things that your experts suggested, the murder problem would go away. In fact, it increased. You know, and so what happened? What went wrong? There's some, one of the things I worry about, and I've shared this with Bob Vassar and Bobby Scott, is have we hit a negative tipping point? I remember working with the Crown Heights riot in New York City in early 90s, and that's supposedly when the murder rates turned around from 2,200 to under 400. All we saw was the violence. It's like a recession. You only find out there's a recession 6 months later. And is New Orleans an isolated case, and we may be, or is it really a harbinger of things to come? Is this a down payment on where we're going? I think we've grown, quite frankly, fat and happy, thinking that murder rates have gone down for the last 17, 18 years, which is true. But that doesn't mean they'll always go away. I want to explain this concern, and this is a future prediction, not a historical prediction, and others may disagree. Okay, let me tell you a story of murder in New Orleans, and it's reaching a peak today because we're signing a consent decree with the federal government. We're giving our police department to the feds today. When I moved to New Orleans in 1994, the police department was about as dysfunctional as any group of people could be. They fired 560 people, 200 went to jail. They had a thing called the rabbit. Anybody know what the rabbit is? The rabbit was a police officer dressed in a bunny costume and would beat up the prisoners. We had an officer, Lynn Davis, who married a gal, Kim Grove, and was monitored by the FBI, who told him they needed the cell phones to guard a drug warehouse. And then in the late 1990s, Richard Pennington when I was at the Police Foundation here in D.C., and I worked with Richard in Fort David and Anacostia. That's not where he came down, he just came down. And he and the current superintendent, Ronnie Surpass, reduced the murder total from 421 to 159, 72% reduction. And again, we had this enormous reduction in murder risk. They saturated it. And a lot of it was a product of federal funding. The cop shop then had $2 billion, BJA had $2 billion to give law enforcement. And there was to saturate drug areas and implement innovative programs. But the murder rate went down. Often with some collateral damages. We had in 2004 100,000 arrests. In 2005, as anybody knows, we had a calamity, Hurricane Katrina. And the best model we have of what happened is the drug dealers go to Houston. They merge with other drug dealers. We had, for a period, believe it or not, commuter murderers. They leave Houston in the morning. There's a guy, B. Stupid Harris, who you know, and you kill people and you go back home. They also learned really bad habits from Houston drug cartels. The murder rate just started ascending, beginning in 2005. The year of conference, we had 210 murders. And then we had the police chief who was Warren Riley, and he was able, over the next couple of years, to reduce the murder rate to 175. And here comes my problem. We were down to 175 murders. Why did we go back up to 200? What happened? Who gets murdered in New Orleans? The victims are almost always young and black. They mostly have criminal records. Who murders in New Orleans? Very similar statistics. In fact, our murderers and our murderees are virtually identical. The nexus, I think, is this tie, and I'm working with Ms. Stasia Walsh from CGS and BJA on Second Chance Project. and there's a nexus of having been in prison. So not only is prison a waste of money, it makes murder probably more likely. And here's some surprises, and take a look at these numbers, really, if you can. And I find them shocking, and they're shocking in its failing. One is, New Orleans, except for Detroit, is almost all alone in its murder risks. Again, Richmond, my daughter Adria is here who works in Richmond. The contrast between Richmond and New Orleans is just shocking. I mean, they were the same in 2002. They're both, New Orleans was 54,100,000, Richmond's was 47.5. And this crime miracle that all of you in Richmond have done. My granddaughter, Adria's daughter, goes to public school. Doesn't even think about it. Likes it better than private school. What was it? What did Richmond do? The successful cities do that New Orleans didn't do. Why in some of these cities? And Compton, I got a big argument once with Drew Griffin, CNN, and the police chief. That we couldn't be like Compton. That's crazy. In fact, Compton has about a third of the risk of New Orleans. Why? What? And again, the easiest thing to say. Look at these numbers. Everybody's going down except for us. And the two ways to look at it. One is we're corrupt and weird, which is probably true. And we still have these issues with our police department and government in general. People disappear and go to federal prison regularly. But the other thing is, without a number of support systems, is this the way the rest of the country is going to go? We're down to only 9 cities with murder rates of over 30 per 100,000. When we had our 2007 hearing in New Orleans, there were 16. So things, and I agree with the speakers, things could be under control, but why aren't they? Here we go. So what's wrong? What are we doing wrong? One is we don't clear our murders. I was interviewed by a paper that did a study. New Orleans is down to 36% homicide clearance. That means if you kill somebody, you have a 2 in 3 chances you're not going to get caught. And the chance of being indicted and going to prison is smaller than that. A thriving narco economy, gun availability. Kids in the RSD, I'm a consultant to the Recovery School District, they plan drive-bys at lunch. That's just the way it is. And they all pack when they get home. That's just the way it is. So we have risk factors. We also have gentrification, which raises rents and concentrates poverty into smaller and smaller pockets. Okay, again, what are we doing wrong? And then I know that I want to turn this back to Bobby Scott. I know he's got a lot of ideas on this. Okay, one, there's a real addiction problem in criminal justice, and that is we focus on criminal justice solutions instead of system-wide community prevention. And that's a fantasy that we find hard to let go of. The second thing is, what I find in my studies of New Orleans is there may be only 300 to 500 kids with any risk of getting killed or killing somebody else. It's a small culture of violence, high-risk cohort. I think Steve Trudeau's research, I think Dr. Zago's research, I think Catherine's research can support this. This isn't every kid's thing. This is a small risk pool. And one of the things I think in the Second Chance Act we try and focus it on is focusing on risk, and that's a very important principle. We just have not done that. We do this loosey-goosey, let's cure everybody of everything. Okay, the third thing is, and I had a talk with Dr. Zager, and he actually agrees with me, we focus on partially evidence-based programs. And I hate to put on Chicago Sees Fire, but they went with Chicago Sees Fire because Gary Slutkin came down and gave a heck of a sales pitch. But what really is the evidence in the Northwestern Skoden study? How does it compare with Boston? The research that I read is Boston has a much stronger research record. The other thing is, and this is something where I think that talking to Congress is very important, there's no money when Pennington and Surpass reduced the murder rates in the 90s, the cop shop had $2 billion. BJ had $2 billion. Most of it going to law enforcement. They went from about 800 cops to 1,600 cops. They could saturate the areas. The murder rates went from 421 to 159. Right now, I feel for Ronnie Surpass, though, he yells at me all the time. Because he may not, even with a consent decree, have the liquidity. There may be less than $100 million for 50 states, which are not tied to the entitlement state programs, that you can, will provide liquidity to turn around the murder risks we have. And that's where I think the Congress has a huge, and the voters have a huge role here. Again, what we do is we love tact. It's like we love the Milwaukee model. And the Milwaukee model is fine, but you look at it carefully, and the murder rates go down. Ed Flinders, the chief out there, and then they go up. So we're adopting programs which have some evidence, but not really substantial evidence on which to build a program. We love facts. We love. This is cop bling. We just did a study on the New Orleans Police Department, which is fairly controversial. I think it's going to be some talk about the New York Times tomorrow. And we found the great programs the mayor put together, police chief. The only problem is the black community's not buying and the cops aren't buying. 97% of the cops don't think the police strategy is going in the right direction. They don't have the equipment. And if you did a community survey, you'd find the same thing. So all the programs in the world can't have an impact if nobody's following, no one's buying in. They did a terrible job, and maybe better now with consent decree, of selling it into these critical crime control constituencies. The other things we don't do is we don't focus on the structural problems that are our demise in New Orleans. We have 40,000 people in prison, half of them in Paris jails. And I think you were in Nastasio when she came down to visit a couple of weeks ago, representing BJ, who was shot. We also have DAs who only get paid if the person gets convicted. We have judges whose fees are based on convictions. We have all kinds of perverse economic patterns that have put us in a hole. And if we don't address those kind of perverse incarceration or patterns, we're never going to dig out of this. The other thing is, we believe in fairy tales. And don't want to pick on our mayor, he's very good, I support him. But we had a thing called SOS. So we take people from Whole Foods and they were going to go mentoring projects, right, in the Calio. And unstructured mentoring research is something I've done a lot of research on. It does no good. It's useless. You get it? So we use things that anybody's read, any literature, Dr. Zager said, Dr. Gallagher, you wouldn't do them. But we still continue to do them, and as Bobby Scott said before, because they're politically appealing, not because of any chance of working. The other thing is, we've got to deal with the collateral consequences of prison, court sentencing, with second-generation murderers. We have fathers and mothers, 1,900 women are in prison, and their parentlessness, and we're reaping the second wave of violent crime. Again, what's our hope? And that's what hope comes out of the consent decree that we announced about an hour from now in New Orleans time, is we target the highest risk groups, and I think as the other speakers said, there are things that work. It's just like cancer treatment. Most things don't work, some do. Use the stuff that works. And if we do that, I think we have some chance of digging out of this morass New Orleans has found itself. Again, the last comment is, I hope New Orleans, and we have a good mayor. We have the police chief, Ronnie Surface, is going to be the fourth president, next president, two presidents out for the ICP. These people are good. So what is it? Yeah, and I think the chances of missing in these high-risk cities is very real. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chairman Scott, for having me.
Thank you. We're going to have entertaining questions, but first let me ask Dr. Zager if you can say a word about the predictive techniques, and you mentioned that Colorado could have been predicted. Can you indicate what you meant?
What I really want to do is address again the second part, the micro model approach, because I think it can really address what all the members of the committee are saying. We don't have funds in our various areas, whether it's at George Mason or whether it's in New Orleans, to provide what's needed. And this would free up money in our prison systems specifically and in our state budgets. And the approach is basically, this thing didn't have to happen. Okay, we talked about those two soundbites. A young boy with a good home, a school, and a job doesn't go to jail. Perhaps this guy, because he didn't have a job, that's one of the reasons why he did what he did. And the other thing, I said, a child treats the world the way the world treats the child. Perhaps he perceived bullying. But how can we find it? We can't find that by just judging it. Judgment is less than chance accurate. You'd be better off flipping the coin. And the way to deal with these things is to look at the facts. What happened in Tucson, Arizona, where Honorable Representative Gabby Gifford got shot? And it was a paranoid schizophrenia, an undiagnosed, untreated one. What happened at Columbine, Virginia Tech, and at Northern Illinois? These were unmedicated, undiagnosed, depressed individuals. So we can use this business or military risk appraisal and management technique, and we can find the dangerous people. On the community level, you can use the math model that we've replicated in Chicago to identify the highest risk that Dr. Sharp was talking about, or a small group in New Orleans, and give them a job. And then on the micro level within our organizations, we can use tests. Because you can find, we have 1% of our population is psychotic. 1% is pedophilic. These are biological, medical facts. And you have to diagnose them accurately, and you have to give them medications. 50% of them take the medications, so that's a real challenge. And with pedophilia, we have the Sandusky case, we have Penn State. This is a big issue. And, you know, we have tests that are around. The University of Minnesota uses the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Everyone who wants to come to the university has to take it. Private schools are using these kinds of things. We use these kinds of tests in the airlines. You want to be a pilot, you take these tests. You want to be a policeman, you take these tests. You want to be in the military, you want to be an officer or pilot, you take these tests. We've been using probation and parole decision-making tools for 80 years to decide pre-sentencing and parole. Why don't we use them more widely? We can use them, they're sensitive and specific, they're very reasonable. By diagnosing people, we can avoid these kinds of situations. Colorado's already had 2 of these, Columbine and Aurora, and the solutions are there. Let's think out of the box. Let's use science. Let's use our math models to target our highest risk kids within the urban cities, and let's use science to protect our organizations. We have pockets in the nuclear power plants and in the airlines where people are getting depressed and suicides. We've had one pilot at JetBlue. We had another one the other day that committed suicide in a plane. You know, thank God these didn't become more tragic. So we can cut down that 15,000 per year murder rate. We don't have to live in a society. There is hope. And that's the positive thing I want you to come away from this, that we can do something about it. And there are positive things. And those who want to read this, the editors of the journal have given this book free to those who want to get it. There's something in your handouts. If you access www.amsci.com/Zagar, and then on the register, click New User Registration. The book is given free. And the reason why we want this is because people need to know the facts. What's the science in this? And we really can do something. And you're the future of this country, so we hope, because you're here, you're really dedicated to this issue. And I want to answer it in a positive fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. Please give our panelists a round of applause.